A single mother was on the verge of giving up her baby's special formula, but what happened next left the whole city in shock. At first, no one noticed her. Under the cold, indifferent lights of a large supermarket in Chicago, Eleanor Vance held a worn wallet between her trembling hands. She was barely 27 years old, but she carried a weight on her shoulders that seemed too heavy for just one person. Her daughter, Harper, needed a special formula, and Eleanor could barely afford to buy it. When the cashier announced the total, she felt her heart shrink. "I'm sorry, I'll have to put this back." With eyes full of tears, she slowly pushed the can of formula across the belt. Her lips could barely form an apology that no mother should ever be forced to say. Impatient sighs began behind her, but Eleanor didn't know that someone was watching her. A stranger, a man whose next decision would not only change that night but the entire course of her life, because in that instant, a single can of formula separated a mother from absolute failure. Eleanor Vance already knew the price even before the cashier scanned the item. She had counted her money 3 times before leaving her small apartment, but knowing the price and accepting reality were two very different things. And that day, she was losing the battle. The massive fluorescent lights of the supermarket emitted a constant hum, an empty, cold sound, a noise that filled the enormous space without offering any kind of comfort. For Eleanor, it was the soundtrack to her despair. At 27, she felt that the whole world rested upon her, and the worst part was that she had to carry it entirely alone. Harper was about to turn 1 year old. She was a perfect little girl, with a small nose, eyes as clear as the summer sky, and a smile capable of lighting up any darkness. She was the only truly good thing left in Eleanor's life. The reason for every sacrifice, every hour of overtime, every silent prayer before sleep. But not even thinking about her daughter's smile could dispel the anguish she carried inside that afternoon. In her shopping cart, there were only the bare essentials: a cheap loaf of bread, oatmeal, frozen vegetables, 2 small jars of baby food, and the formula. The dreaded formula. A blue can of a specific hypoallergenic brand that the pediatrician had insistently recommended. Cheaper formulas made Harper cry for hours from stomach pains. That can had become a weekly luxury, a luxury Eleanor always promised to get somehow. She would eat less, work more, sleep less if necessary, but her daughter would have what she needed. The cashier, a young guy named Sam, started scanning the products. Beep, the bread. Beep, the oatmeal. Beep, the vegetables. With each sound, the number on the screen slowly climbed. Eleanor's hands began to sweat. She gripped the old, cracked wallet she kept in her coat pocket tightly. It had belonged to her great-grandfather, a man who fought in a war that almost no one remembered anymore. Inside, there were only a few crumpled bills and some coins, everything she had until her next paycheck. "Is that everything?" Sam asked in an indifferent tone. Eleanor swallowed hard and nodded. Then the cashier grabbed the blue can. The scanner sounded louder, more definitive. "That'll be $31.42. Eleanor felt the air vanish from her lungs. She already knew she didn't have enough. Deep down, she had always known. She had hoped for a discount, a sale, a forgotten coupon, a tiny miracle. But miracles seemed to exist only for other people, not for her. Shame fell over her shoulders like a burning wave. The people behind her began to shift uncomfortably with their carts. I'm sorry." The words barely made it out of her mouth. "I have to put something back." Sam didn't even change his expression. He simply waited. To him, it was an everyday scene. The silent apology, the nervous hands, the lowered gaze. He saw it every day. With trembling fingers, Eleanor took the can of formula. It felt incredibly heavy, as if it were made of lead. In that instant, under the cold lights of the supermarket, Eleanor felt like the worst mother in the world. She was failing her daughter. "This one," she whispered with a broken voice as she pushed the can toward the cashier. "I have to put this back." She didn't want to look at anyone. She couldn't bear to see the pity in strangers' eyes. She felt the stares of the people behind her slowly piercing through her. She wanted to disappear. A few feet away, pretending to look at a shelf of organic juices, stood Alexander Castle. To anyone else, he looked like just another elegant customer in a perfectly tailored dark gray coat. But Alexander was much more than that. He was one of the most prominent tech entrepreneurs in the United States. A billionaire and highly reserved. His face occasionally appeared in financial magazines, though he hated public attention and did everything possible to stay away from cameras and interviews. Beside him was his 5-year-old daughter, Sophia, a little girl with curly hair and serious eyes identical to her father's. Sophia was the absolute center of Alexander's world, the only person capable of bringing him some peace after years of loneliness. They had gone to the supermarket for an absurd reason. Sophia insisted she only wanted a specific organic juice that was exclusively sold there. His personal assistant could have filled the house with entire boxes in less than an hour. But that afternoon, Sophia had looked at him with those huge eyes and said, "I want to go with you, Daddy." And Alexander, a man capable of building empires but incapable of denying his daughter anything, immediately agreed. He had been watching Eleanor for several minutes. He had seen her hands trembling, the shame on her face, the way she tried to stay strong while the world seemed to slowly crush her. And when he saw her give back the formula, something shifted inside him, something that had been asleep for years. "Daddy," Sophia whispered as she gently tugged on the sleeve of his coat, "why does that lady look so sad?" Alexander looked down at his daughter. How could he explain something like that? How could he explain to a little girl that some mothers had to choose between feeding themselves or properly feeding their children? How could he explain the silent injustice of the world? "She's just having a hard day, sweetheart," he replied in a soft voice. He watched as Eleanor paid for her few groceries. Her shoulders were slumped, as if she were carrying invisible tons. She took her small plastic bag and walked toward the exit with her head down, trying to make herself invisible in the crowd. And in that instant, Alexander Castle made a decision. He wasn't going to let that woman disappear into the night. He wasn't going to let her carry all of that alone. He didn't know exactly why. He just knew he had to do something. He crouched down to Sophia's eye level. "Sweetheart, I need you to wait right here with Mr. Reynolds for a moment, okay?" The security guard at the entrance, a kind man who discreetly worked for Alexander on special occasions, nodded with a calm smile. Sophia trusted him, so she agreed without protest. Alexander quickly went back to the register and grabbed the can of formula Eleanor had left behind. Then he added a few more things: a hot rotisserie chicken, freshly baked bread, fresh apples, and a box of Sophia's favorite cookies. He paid for everything in cash. Then, he lone sape out into the cold air of the Chicago night. His eyes scanned the massive, illuminated parking lot until he found her. She was sitting alone at a bus stop at the far end of the lot. The small bag rested near her feet. She was staring blankly ahead, empty, lost. She looked tiny under the dark vastness of the sky. Alexander approached slowly. He didn't want to startle her. "Excuse me," he said in a calm voice. Eleanor gave a small jump, startled. She looked up in confusion. She saw an elegant man holding 2 grocery bags. Her first reaction was to think she had done something wrong. "I believe you forgot this," Alexander said, holding out the bag that contained the formula. Eleanor looked at the can, then back at him. The shame hit her all over again instantly. "I didn't forget it," she replied quietly. "I couldn't afford it." "I know," Alexander answered calmly. "That's why I bought it for you." Eleanor froze completely. She didn't know what to say. She looked at him closely, searching for pity or superiority in his eyes, but she found neither, only a strange sincerity. And that bewildered her even more, because in her life, the kindness of strangers wasn't a common occurrence. It was suspicious, strange. "I can't accept this," she finally said, gathering the little pride she still had left. It was the only thing she had. Alexander shook his head gently. "Please, it's just milk for your daughter. She needs it." He looked at the small pink baby diaper bag next to her on the bench. "You have a little girl, right?" Eleanor nodded slowly. "Her name is Harper." A small smile appeared on Alexander's face. That's a beautiful name. I have a daughter too. Sophia is 5. He offered the bag again. Consider it a gift from one parent to another. Eleanor hesitated. Inside her, pride fought against the fierce love she felt for her daughter. But Harper needed that formula, and in the end, that was the only thing that mattered. With eyes full of tears, she slowly took the bag. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't know how to thank you." "There's no need," Alexander replied. He looked at the empty road in front of them. "It's cold out, and the bus might take a while. If you'd like, I can give you a ride home." He discreetly pointed to a black car parked nearby. Elegant, understated, and clearly very expensive. A driver was waiting by the door. Eleanor's eyes widened slightly. This was too much. The formula was one thing. Getting into a car that probably cost more than she would make in years was entirely different. "No, really, I can't," she said quickly. "The bus will be here soon." "I insist," Alexander replied with gentle firmness. "It's late, and it's no trouble." Before she could refuse again, he took her shopping bag. His fingers accidentally brushed against Eleanor's, and a strange warmth traveled up her arm. Then she truly looked at him for the first time. Beyond the elegant coat, beyond the natural confidence he exuded, she saw exhaustion in his eyes. A deep exhaustion, and also sadness, a silent sadness that not even his smile could completely hide. He didn't seem like just a rich man trying to feel good about himself. There was something different about him, something real. Still confused, she let him guide her to the car. The driver immediately opened the rear door. The interior felt like another world, silent, warm, smelling of clean leather and something hard to describe. The smell of wealth, but also of tranquility. Alexander picked up Sophia, who climbed into the back seat, watching Eleanor with curiosity. "Sophia, this is Eleanor Vance," Alexander said. "She and her daughter are coming home with us." "Hello," the little girl whispered shyly. For the first time that night, Eleanor truly smiled. "Hi, Sophia. It's so nice to meet you." The ride was quiet, though strangely comfortable. Alexander asked for the address, and Eleanor gave it, feeling a new pang of shame imagining the building where she lived, a neighborhood he had probably never set foot in. But Alexander didn't react. He simply relayed the address to the driver and started quietly playing I Spy with Sophia. Eleanor watched them the entire way. The connection between father and daughter was obvious, beautiful. But even while he laughed softly with Sophia, Alexander still had that sadness in his eyes. The same loneliness Eleanor recognized within herself every night. When they finally arrived at the building, Eleanor felt the urge to apologize. The old brick block looked even more run-down under the yellow streetlights. The cracked stairs, the peeling paint, everything seemed to scream poverty. But Alexander said absolutely nothing. He just took the bags and said calmly, "I'll walk you up." "You've already done too much," Eleanor muttered. "Let me help you." And once again, it was impossible to argue with him. They walked up the 2 flights of stairs together in a narrow, poorly lit stairwell. The hallway smelled of dampness and reheated food. A flickering light bulb barely illuminated the corridor. It was a completely different world from the elegant, silent interior of the car. When they reached the last door in the hall, Eleanor nervously searched her bag for her keys. Suddenly, she felt profoundly ashamed. The peeling paint on the door, the old welcome mat, the worn walls. Everything seemed miserable compared to the man standing behind her. She finally unlocked the door, and as soon as it opened, a happy little sound filled the apartment. "Mama." Harper was inside a makeshift playpen in the corner of the living room. Her eyes lit up when she saw her mother. All the weight Eleanor had carried throughout the day vanished in an instant. She dropped the bags and ran to her daughter. She picked her up in her arms and buried her face in the baby's soft hair. She was home. And as long as Harper was okay, she could endure anything else. Alexander watched the scene in silence from the doorway. Something inside his chest tightened gently. "This is Harper," Eleanor said quietly as she rubbed the baby's back. Then, Alexander smiled for real. A warm, honest smile, a smile that completely transformed his face. She's perfect. His eyes discreetly scanned the small apartment. It was humble, very small. The furniture was old and simple, but everything was impeccably clean. On a shelf, there were some children's books and several carefully arranged family photos. He didn't see wealth, but he did see love. A lot of love. And in that instant, standing in the doorway of that small apartment, Alexander felt something he hadn't felt in years. Human connection. Something real, something sincere. Something that couldn't be bought. He slowly handed her the bags. "It was a pleasure meeting you, Eleanor." Hearing her name in that man's voice gave her a strange feeling. Warm. Almost too warm. "Thank you again," she replied. "You really don't know how much this meant to me tonight." Alexander looked at her intently for a few seconds. "I think I do." And during that brief silence, something impossible to explain happened. Two people from completely different worlds understood each other without the need for words. It was as if they both recognized the same exhaustion, the same loneliness, the same need to be truly seen by someone. Finally, Alexander took a step back. "Good night, Eleanor." "Good night, Alexander." He slowly walked down the stairs, and as the car drove away down the street, a strange feeling began to grow inside his chest. Hope. He didn't know it yet, but that chance encounter in a supermarket hadn't been the end of a story. It had been the beginning. The following days felt different for Eleanor. The gray cloud that had been crushing her for months seemed to have lifted slightly. Not because of the formula or even the help, but because for the first time in a very long time, someone had truly seen her. In a world that constantly made her feel invisible, a stranger had looked past her poverty. He had seen a mother, a person, someone worthy of compassion and respect. That night, after putting Harper to sleep, Eleanor sat in silence at the kitchen table. The blue can rested on the counter like an unforgettable memory. She brewed a cup of hot tea and mentally replayed everything that had happened. The man's name was Alexander. His daughter's name was Sophia. That was all she knew. She would probably never see him again. He had just been a kind stranger crossing her path at the right moment. But that small action had awakened something inside her. Something she thought had died a long time ago. Hope. For months she had lived trapped in an exhausting cycle. Wake up, get Harper ready, drop her off with the babysitter, work 8 hours at a coffee shop, pick Harper up, cook, clean, sleep, and repeat. Her paycheck barely covered survival. There was never anything left over. There was no room for dreams or thinking about the future, just surviving. But now, a small, fragile idea was beginning to grow in her head. She deserved something better, and so did Harper. On the old shelf rested a photograph of her great-grandfather, Sergeant Matthew Vance, a man who had served in the United States military decades ago. As a child, Eleanor had grown up listening to stories about him. Stories of bravery, honor, sacrifice. What would he think if he could see her now? Barely surviving, too tired even to dream. The next morning, Eleanor woke up feeling different, with more energy, more determination. She prepared Harper's breakfast, and while the baby took a nap, she did something she had been avoiding for years. She sat down with a blank sheet of paper and began writing down her skills. She was responsible, hardworking, organized. Before getting pregnant, she had worked as a receptionist in a small law firm, and she was good at it, but the salary wasn't enough to pay for childcare, so she had to quit. She pulled out an old laptop and started looking for jobs. The Wi-Fi from the cafe downstairs barely worked, but she persisted anyway. Many positions asked for impossible experience. Others required college degrees. Little by little, the discouragement started to return, but this time, she didn't give up. Then she found an ad, Administrative Assistant, Chicago Veterans Community Center. The salary was slightly better than the coffee shop. The hours were better too. But there was something more important. The job had meaning. She felt it was exactly the kind of place her great-grandfather would have wanted to see her. She took a deep breath and started preparing her resume. Meanwhile, across the city, in a massive minimalist mansion overlooking Chicago, Alexander Castle couldn't forget the encounter at the supermarket either. His life was a perfectly organized world of meetings, investments, and multi-million-dollar decisions, a world of extreme luxury and absolute loneliness. His wife, Victoria, had passed away 3 years ago. Since then, something inside him had shut down. Sophia was the only thing keeping his heart beating, but even as a father, he often felt like he was just managing his own household, like just another corporation. The image of Eleanor wouldn't leave his mind. The way she tried to maintain her dignity while crumbling inside, the way she protected her daughter, even amidst humiliation. And that small apartment, humble, yes, but filled with something he hadn't seen in years. Warmth, truth, real life. Alexander thought about her constantly during important meetings, while signing million-dollar contracts, even in the middle of video calls with international investors. The image of Eleanor at that supermarket checkout kept appearing in his mind. The shame in her eyes, the silent strength with which she kept moving forward for her daughter, and something else, the way Harper looked at her with absolute trust, with total love. That had hit him deeply, because he knew very well the feeling of losing everything. After Victoria's death, he had built walls around himself. Walls made of work, money, silence. But that night in Eleanor's apartment, he had felt something different, something human, and he couldn't get it out of his head. He wanted to help her, but he also knew he had to do it the right way. He had seen the pride in her eyes. The last thing he wanted was to humiliate her by making her feel like a charity case. A handout would have been an insult to someone like her. He needed to give her an opportunity, not a gift. For the first time in many years, Alexander used his personal resources for something private. He called David Rhodes, his head of security and a former intelligence agent. "I need you to find out something about a person." David looked up. This was strange. Alexander never asked for things like this. Just basic background information, Alexander clarified immediately. Nothing invasive. David nodded. Understood. A day later, a brown folder appeared on Alexander's desk. Inside were just a few pages. Address, employment history, no criminal record, a completely normal life. Until he read a name. Sergeant Matthew Vance. Alexander froze. He knew that last name. His grandfather, Thomas Castle, had talked about him his entire life. Matthew Vance had served alongside him decades ago, and not only that he had saved his life. Alexander slowly opened an old drawer in his desk. He pulled out an old leather notebook. His grandfather's personal diary. He quickly flipped through the yellowed pages until he found the name. Matthew Vance. And there it was, line after line, accounts of a forgotten battle. The story of a brave man who had risked everything to save his comrades, including Thomas Castle. Alexander felt a shiver run down his spine. It couldn't be a coincidence. The grandson of the man who was saved, finding, decades later, the great-granddaughter of the man who made the sacrifice. Right at the most difficult moment of her life. Suddenly, everything changed for him. It was no longer just about helping a stranger, it was a debt. A debt of honor. One that his family had carried for generations. But, once again, the same problem arose. How could he help her without destroying her dignity? He couldn't just show up with cash. He couldn't buy her future. He had to build a real opportunity for her. And then, finally, he had an idea. He canceled all his meetings for that afternoon, ignored calls, emails, everything. He sat looking at a photograph of Sophia on his desk and thought about the kind of man he wanted his daughter to remember someday. Not just a businessman, not just a billionaire, but someone capable of honoring the past, someone capable of doing the right thing. When the sun began to set over Chicago, Alexander had already made a decision. He called David again. "I need you to set up a meeting." A week later, Eleanor received a call. "Miss Vance? We're calling from the Chicago Veterans Community Center. We've reviewed your application, and we'd like to interview you tomorrow." Eleanor's heart leaped. She spent the entire night preparing, carefully ironing her only formal blouse, memorizing every line of her resume. She asked an elderly neighbor to watch Harper for an hour, and the next day, she arrived at the community center with an unbearable mix of hope and nerves. The building was simple but welcoming. The walls were lined with old photographs of American soldiers and their families. A kind woman named Carmen Roberts welcomed her into a small office. The interview went surprisingly well. Eleanor talked about her work experience, about Harper, about her great-grandfather Matthew Vance, and the pride she felt for her family history. Carmen seemed impressed. At the end of the interview, she smiled warmly. "You are an extraordinary young woman, Eleanor." Eleanor felt a small spark of hope, but then Carmen took a deep breath. However, the administrative position was just filled this morning. Eleanor's heart plummeted. She tried to smile politely again. "I understand. Thank you for your time anyway." She stood up slowly. She knew that feeling too well, defeat. But just as she was about to leave, Carmen spoke again, though there might be another opportunity. Eleanor turned around, confused. Carmen slid a document across the desk. At the top, it read, "The Vance Legacy Program." Eleanor frowned. Her own last name was right there. "Our main benefactor just funded this new program," Carmen explained. "It's designed to help the descendants of U.S. veterans. Education, professional training, financial support. A new opportunity to rebuild their lives." Eleanor stood completely still. She didn't understand. "You would be the first beneficiary." Eleanor slowly looked up. "Me? Your application ended up in the right hands," Carmen continued, smiling. "And someone personally insisted that you receive this opportunity." Eleanor felt tears beginning to well up. It didn't seem real. "Who is funding this?" Carmen smiled softly. "He prefers to remain anonymous." But Eleanor couldn't stop thinking about one person. A man with tired eyes. A man who appeared at a bus stop holding a blue can of baby formula. "The program will cover your tuition, and you will also receive a monthly stipend," Carmen continued. "You'll have stability while you build a future for yourself and for Harper." Eleanor looked at the document again. For the first time in a very long time, the future didn't look dark. It looked possible. And then, with tears slowly falling down her cheeks, she replied, "Yes." Her voice trembled, but it was full of a new strength. "Yes, I want to do it." The Vance Legacy Program changed Eleanor's life much faster than she had imagined. It wasn't just money, it was stability. It was air after years of feeling like she was drowning. The first thing she did was move. She found a small 2-bedroom apartment in a quiet neighborhood in Chicago. It wasn't luxurious, but it was safe. There was a small park nearby. The windows let in the warm afternoon light, and for the first time since Harper's birth, Eleanor felt she could breathe easily. She started creating a new routine. During the day, all her attention was dedicated to Harper. They went to the park, to the children's library. They spent hours playing on the living room rug, and Harper changed right along with her. The little girl seemed to feel the peace that was slowly returning to her mother's life. Her first words became clearer. Her shaky little steps turned into clumsy runs around the apartment. But at night, after putting Harper to bed, another Eleanor emerged. She brewed coffee, opened her laptop, and studied. Thanks to the program, she had started an online business administration degree at a local community college. At first, it was exhausting. Many times she ended up falling asleep in front of the screen. But every page read, every exam passed, made her feel alive again. She was no longer surviving, she was building something. Sometimes she thought about the anonymous benefactor. In her mind, she pictured an older man, maybe a former military officer, someone who simply wanted to help. She even wrote a thank you letter to him, a long and sincere letter. She explained how that opportunity had changed not only her financial situation, but also how she saw herself. She never connected the benefactor to Alexander. In her head, they were two separate stories. The kind man from the supermarket and the stranger who had funded the program. She never imagined they were the same person. 3 months later, Carmen Roberts called her again. "Eleanor, I need to ask you a favor." Of course. Next week, we're hosting a small reception to officially present the Vance Legacy program. Sponsors, military families, and community representatives will be there. Eleanor's stomach immediately tightened. And we would love for you to say a few words as the first beneficiary. Eleanor felt instant panic. Public speaking was a nightmare. I don't think I can do that. Yes, you can, Carmen replied softly. Just speak from the heart. Then she added something that changed everything. Besides, the main benefactor will be attending personally. Eleanor fell silent. This was her chance. She could finally thank him face to face. Even though it terrified her, she knew she had to do it. Okay, I'll be there. The following days were a mess of nerves. She wrote the speech over and over again. Nothing sounded right. Finally, she bought a dark blue dress on sale at an inexpensive store. It was the first new piece of clothing she had bought for herself in years. The night of the event, she left Harper with her neighbor and drove to the community center. The hall was decorated simply but elegantly. White tablecloths, small floral arrangements, old photos of American veterans. The room was filled with business owners, retired military personnel, and local representatives. Eleanor felt completely out of place. She clutched her small purse nervously, and then she saw him across the room. Alexander Castle was wearing an impeccable dark suit, but he still had that same calm, deep gaze she remembered perfectly. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. What was he doing there? Was he a donor? Did he work with the center? As if feeling her gaze, Alexander slowly turned his head. Their eyes met, and a small smile appeared on his face. Calm, sincere. For a few seconds, Eleanor felt the noise of the room completely disappear. Alexander excused himself from the people he was talking to and started walking toward her. With every step, something began to slowly click in Eleanor's mind. The anonymous benefactor. The personal insistence. The name of the program. The military connection of her family. It wasn't impossible, was it? Eleanor, Alexander said when he stopped in front of her. I'm so glad to see you again. Eleanor's voice barely came out. Alexander, what are you doing here? He smiled slightly. I could ask you the same thing. Before she could answer, Carmen appeared, looking excited. Perfect, you found each other. Eleanor frowned in confusion. Carmen smiled broadly. Eleanor, this is Alexander Castle, the main founder of the Vance Legacy program. The world seemed to stop. Eleanor stood completely still, looking at him, trying to understand. It was him all along. It had been him, the man who bought her the formula, the man who gave her a chance, the man who had literally changed her life. The two stories had always been the same one. You, Eleanor whispered, unable to process it. Alexander's expression softened. He could perfectly see the storm of emotions in her eyes. Maybe we should step outside to talk, he said calmly. It's too loud in here. Eleanor nodded slowly, still in shock. Alexander led her to a small outdoor courtyard lit by warm lights. The cool Chicago night air gently brushed their faces. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Finally, Eleanor broke the silence. Why did you do all of this for me? Alexander rested a hand on the brick wall and briefly looked up at the night sky before answering. Because our stories started long before we were born. He remained silent for a few seconds before continuing. My grandfather's name was Thomas Castle. He served in the same military unit as your great-grandfather, Matthew Vance. Eleanor frowned slightly. Alexander went on. My grandfather talked about him constantly. He said he was the bravest man he had ever met. Eleanor's breathing slowed. During a military operation, your great-grandfather saved his life. He saved several other soldiers that day too. Among them, my grandfather. Eleanor felt a chill. Alexander looked directly at her. My family never forgot that debt. For the first time, Eleanor fully understood the weight of it all. It wasn't charity. It wasn't pity. It was honor. It was history. It was a promise that had survived entire generations. When I saw you that night in the supermarket, I didn't know who you were yet, Alexander admitted. I just saw a mother fighting alone. But later, when I found out your last name, I realized it wasn't a coincidence. Eleanor felt her eyes fill with tears. All the shame she had felt for months began to slowly wash away because Alexander had never looked down on her. He had never treated her as inferior. He was looking at her as the descendant of an honorable man, as someone worthy of respect. My great-grandfather was always almost a legend to me, Eleanor whispered. An old photo on a shelf, stories I heard as a little girl. Alexander smiled softly. And now his legacy lives on through you. Those words struck something very deep inside Eleanor. For so long, she had felt like a failure. But for the first time, someone saw strength in her, not weakness. A comfortable silence settled between them. She no longer saw Alexander as the billionaire, and he no longer saw Eleanor as the woman from the supermarket. Now, they looked at each other as two people connected by something much bigger than themselves. But the moment was abruptly broken. Alexander, there you are. An elegant female voice interrupted the conversation. They both turned their heads. A tall, sophisticated woman had just stepped out into the courtyard. Blonde, perfectly groomed, dressed in an obviously expensive designer suit. Her smile was flawless, but her eyes were not. There was something cold in them. Something calculating. Penelope Reeves, Alexander said with a much more formal smile. Eleanor, she is on the center's board of directors. Penelope's eyes scanned Eleanor from top to bottom in less than a second. Simple dress, cheap shoes, inexpensive bag. She evaluated everything and judged her immediately. Ah, so you are Eleanor Vance, she said with a polite but clearly fake smile. The beneficiary. The way she pronounced the word beneficiary made Eleanor feel instantly small. Nice to meet you, Eleanor replied, trying to maintain her composure. She extended her hand, but Penelope practically ignored the gesture and turned all her attention back to Alexander. The speeches are about to begin. You said you would sit at my table. And without asking permission, she gently took Alexander's arm. A seemingly elegant gesture, but full of intention, as if she wanted to make something very clear. Alexander politely withdrew his arm. I'll be right there. For a fraction of a second, Penelope's smile tightened just a bit, but Eleanor noticed. Don't take too long, she said before going back inside. And just before disappearing, she shot another look at Eleanor. A silent gaze, a warning. The warm atmosphere between Eleanor and Alexander vanished immediately. Eleanor felt out of place again. Small. Ridiculous. Alexander sighed slightly. I'm sorry about that. It's fine, Eleanor lied quickly. But it wasn't fine, because for the first time she remembered who Alexander Castle really was. An extremely powerful, wealthy, important man. And she was still Eleanor Vance, the girl who almost couldn't afford baby formula. You should go inside, Alexander said gently. You're going to do great. Eleanor let out a small, nervous laugh. I'm not so sure. Just speak from the heart, he replied. That always works. Minutes later, Eleanor stood in front of the microphone. Dozens of people were watching her. Business leaders, veterans, local politicians. She felt her legs trembling. She had prepared a whole speech, but when she looked up, everything vanished from her mind. So, she decided to tell the truth. The real truth. A few months ago, I was in a supermarket trying to decide whether to buy food for myself or milk for my daughter. The room went completely silent. Eleanor's voice was soft but authentic, and that made everyone listen. She talked about the fear, about the shame, about feeling invisible. She talked about Harper, about the nights crying alone, about her great-grandfather, Matthew Vance, not as a distant hero, but as the man whose bravery she tried to honor even on her worst days. Then she looked directly at Alexander. This program didn't just give me financial help, it gave me back something I had lost a long time ago. She paused for a moment. Hope. Many of the veterans present began to get emotional. Some discreetly wiped their eyes. The legacy of our grandparents shouldn't just remain in old photographs or forgotten medals. It must stay alive in the opportunities we give to the next generations. Eleanor took a deep breath and finished with a simple but powerful sentence. "Thank you for giving my daughter a future, and thank you for giving me mine back." For a few seconds, no one spoke, and then the whole room erupted in applause. Real, sincere applause. Eleanor felt her chest tremble. As she slowly walked back to her seat, several people approached to congratulate her. For the first time in a very long time, she didn't feel out of place, she felt valued. And amidst the crowd, Alexander watched her in silence, with pride, a pride impossible to hide. But across the room, Penelope Reeves was watching the exact same scene. And in her eyes, something much more dangerous than contempt was beginning to appear. Jealousy. The following week started off quietly, but beneath the surface, something dark was slowly moving. Penelope Reeves was not a woman used to losing attention. For years, she had been one of the most important figures in Chicago's charitable and corporate circles. Elegant, influential, untouchable. And now, suddenly, all conversations revolved around Eleanor Vance, the young single mother, the humble girl from the Vance Legacy program. Worse yet, Alexander Castle looked at her in a way Penelope had never managed to provoke in him, with genuine interest, with admiration, with humanity. And that drove her crazy. So, she started slowly, subtly, with elegant venom. During board meetings, she made seemingly innocent comments. "The program is lovely, though perhaps it's too much money for just one person." Other times she would say, "We must ensure that emotional decisions don't affect the foundation's transparency." She never mentioned Eleanor directly. She didn't need to. Everyone understood the insinuation perfectly. Little by little, the rumors began. That Eleanor had a special relationship with Alexander, that the program existed solely for her, that a widowed billionaire was being manipulated by a needy mother. Cruel, false, but dangerous rumors. Carmen Roberts tried to stop them several times without success. Penelope had too much influence. Finally, the board called an official meeting to review the legitimacy of the Vance Legacy program. The afternoon before, Carmen called Eleanor. Her voice sounded worried. "Penelope wants to temporarily suspend the program while they investigate possible conflicts of interest." Eleanor felt a freezing void in her stomach. Everything she had built seemed to be falling apart. But this time, something different happened inside her. She didn't break. She got angry. Because it was no longer just about her. Penelope was dirtying Matthew Vance's name. She was destroying something that could help so many families. The Eleanor from months ago would have cried hiding at home, but that Eleanor no longer existed. "When is the meeting?" she asked calmly. The next morning, Eleanor walked into the community center's boardroom. Everyone turned their heads immediately. The tension was palpable. Penelope was seated at the head of the table, perfectly elegant, perfectly cold. Alexander was also there, and his serious expression made it clear he knew exactly what was happening. The meeting began. Penelope spoke first. Her voice was flawless, professional, polite, but completely venomous. "We must protect the reputation of this institution. Transparency and impartiality are fundamental when administering such significant funds." Several board members avoided looking at Eleanor. Penelope continued, "I simply consider it prudent to temporarily pause this program until we review certain personal ties that could generate inappropriate interpretations." She had finally said it. Indirectly, but she had said it. Silence filled the room. No one wanted to intervene. Penelope had too much power. Then Eleanor slowly stood up. Her hands trembled a little, but her voice did not. "My name is Eleanor Vance." Everyone looked at her. "And I am exactly the person you are talking about." Penelope smiled slightly, as if she had expected this. But Eleanor continued. "You talk about transparency, Miss Reeves, but what really bothers you isn't the program." The room sat frozen. "What bothers you is me." Penelope narrowed her eyes slightly. Eleanor took a deep breath. "You look at me and only see a poor mother. You see someone who, according to you, doesn't belong in places like this." No one moved. No one breathed. "But this program isn't about me. It's about entire families who sacrificed generations for this country. It's about the children and grandchildren of forgotten people. Eleanor looked around the table. Trying to destroy it out of personal pride would be a profound disrespect to all of them. Penelope let out a short, dry laugh. What an emotional speech. But facts remain facts. You had a prior personal relationship with Mr. Castle. And then, a deep voice broke the silence. She is right. Everyone turned their heads toward Alexander. He slowly stood up and walked toward the center of the table, holding an old leather notebook, his grandfather's diary. The room went completely silent. Alexander carefully opened to a marked page. This diary belonged to my grandfather, Thomas Castle. His voice was firm, confident. Here he describes the day Sergeant Matthew Vance saved his life during a military operation. He placed several old photographs on the table. Black and white images of young soldiers, among them Thomas Castle and Matthew Vance. Smiling together. Alive. Several board members began to look at the photos in surprise. Alexander continued. My family has been trying to honor that debt for over 70 years. Then he looked directly at Penelope, and for the first time, his voice lost all its softness. The Vance Legacy Program is not an act of charity. It is a debt of honor. The tension in the room was unbearable. Eleanor Vance did not receive this program out of pity. She received it because she represents the legacy of a man who saved entire generations of my family. Penelope sat completely still. Her narrative had just been shattered in front of everyone. There were no more rumors or insinuations. Only truth, history, honor. The board voted that same afternoon. Unanimously, the Vance Legacy Program would not only continue, but it would be officially expanded nationwide. Penelope Reeves discreetly resigned from the board a week later. And although no one said it openly, everyone knew why. 2 years passed, and the world kept turning, but for Eleanor Vance, everything had changed. She finished her business administration degree at the top of her class, and just as Alexander had promised, she began working alongside him at the Castle Foundation. Her main responsibility was to direct and expand the Vance Legacy Program, the very same program that had once saved her. Now she helped dozens of veterans' families across the United States. Fathers, mothers, children. People who, just like Eleanor back then, only needed a real opportunity to get back on their feet. Eleanor worked tirelessly, but this time she didn't do it out of fear. She did it out of hope. One warm spring afternoon, Alexander and Eleanor were sitting on a blanket in Millennium Park. A few yards away, Sophia and Harper were laughing and running among the trees. Sophia was 7 now. Harper was 3. They looked like sisters, and in many ways, they already were. Eleanor gently rested her head on Alexander's shoulder. The gesture was natural, familiar now. Because their story hadn't been born out of a fairy tale. It had grown slowly, with conversations, with shared silences, with respect, with understood wounds. Alexander never tried to rescue her, and Eleanor never saw him just as a rich man. They had fallen in love like two broken people who learned to rebuild themselves together. You know something funny? Eleanor said, watching Harper chase a butterfly. Alexander smiled slightly. What's that? Sometimes I still think about that woman in the supermarket. Alexander turned his head toward her. The woman in the supermarket. Eleanor let out a small laugh. Yeah. The one who was completely lost, the one who felt like she had failed as a mother. Alexander gently put his arm around her. I think about her a lot too. Eleanor looked up. You do? Alexander nodded slowly. And I also think about that man who was so lonely that he had forgotten what it felt like to truly connect with someone. Eleanor smiled. A calm, real smile. The kind of smile that is only born after surviving a lot of pain. Alexander looked toward the girls, then back at Eleanor. You didn't just build a new life for you and Harper. His voice was low, sincere. You saved mine, too. Eleanor's eyes grew slightly misty. Alexander continued. Before I met you, I thought legacy was money, companies, power, things that survive in newspapers or buildings. He looked at Harper and Sophia laughing together. But now I understand that true legacy is the people you help up. Eleanor gently took his hand. And for a few seconds, they stayed like that, in silence, without needing to say anything else. Because they both knew exactly everything they had gone through to get there. The journey had been strange, painful, improbable, but also beautiful. And as the late afternoon sun covered the park in golden light, Eleanor understood something important. Sometimes, life changes completely in a single instant. A small decision, a silent gesture, a simple can of baby formula at a supermarket checkout. That had been the beginning of it all. The proof that the smallest acts of kindness can span entire generations and that debts of honor never truly disappear. They only wait for the right moment to return.